Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this lecture organized by the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. We're pleased to have with us today Dr. Michael Hudson, who is the Seif Ghobash Professor of Arab Studies and International Relations Emeritus at Georgetown University and Professor of Political Science at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. We're also pleased that he's currently with us as an IFI visiting fellow. Dr. Hudson today will be presenting a lecture, which is of timely interest and relevance, on pivoting, advancing, or retreating, how Washington is coping with a chaotic Middle East. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the management of the Issam Fares Institute, Rami Khouri, the retiring director of that Institute, Tariq Mitri, the incoming director, Ryan Al-Amin, the acting director, and Karim Makdisi, who is in charge of the new master's program in public policy and international affairs. They've all been very kind and helpful, and it's always nice to be back at AUB. AUB is a university with which I have quite a long and very close and rather personal connection. I came out to AUB in the mid-1960s as a graduate student at Yale, and with the assignment to try to research and write a dissertation about political development in deeply divided societies, and the deeply divided society that my supervisor I had chosen was Lebanon. And I showed up without any formal connection to AUB, but the people at AUB really took me under their collective wing. And so I learned a lot. I used to sit in on Kamal Salibi's History of the Middle East class and had many fruitful conversations with him, and then people in the political studies department, particularly Walid al-Khalidi at the time, contributed a great deal to my, at that point, very inadequate education about the region. During the long civil war in Lebanon, I visited a number of times, and I was at Georgetown during most of that period when we received some scholars from AUB that, for understandable reasons, could not operate in civil wartime Lebanon. Among them, in particular, Hannah Batatu, who then stayed at Georgetown for a very long time, Halim Barakat, Marius Deeb, and Ibrahim. They were all with us, so much so that people used to joke that we were AUB West in the Center for Arab Studies at Georgetown in those years. I was here, would have been 1984, during at the time when your former president, Malcolm Kerr, was murdered. That was a very traumatic experience for me. He was an old friend of mine, a colleague, and I would have had coffee with him on the afternoon of the day that he was assassinated. So it was an honor to come back a year or so ago at the commemoration for Malcolm Kerr that was held here. So I do feel right at home. Now, since the big man has just entered the room, Rami Khouri, this is the time for me to tell you what he told me, which is make your points right off the bat at the beginning, because you never know. The power might go out, people might start to leave, you might fall asleep in your own lecture. So you'd better get the main points out. So I will try to do that, and this is the way I propose to do it. I want to start off with my own critique of President Obama's performance so you know where I'm coming from and where I will end up. And then I want to move into a brief sort of theoretical excursion simply to illustrate three different approaches to the study of foreign policy making in general. These are approaches in Western American political and social sciences. And then I want to examine the American performance in this increasingly turbulent region in terms of four problems. I'll talk a little bit about what I call the history problem, and then the framing problem, which is how things are kind of presented to the decision makers, and the institutional problem, which will deal really with the domestic context in which policy is formulated. And finally, and maybe most importantly, I must say a few things about the region itself, because that's what U.S. Middle East policy is all about, trying to cope with a plethora of conflicts and confusing situations in the region. So, Obama's performance. I voted for him, and we were all attracted by this famous campaign poster inscribed with the word hope. And we all hoped that the new president would help us out of very important domestic crises and some serious foreign crises as well. I think it turns out in the long run that perhaps Mr. Obama was more successful in helping us out of the financial crisis, beginning to institute a flawed but still very significant healthcare program, and undertaking a number of other domestic measures which were not easy but were, I think, needed and welcome. I think the record on the foreign policy side is more mixed, and when it comes to the Middle East, I would say that my critique is more in sorrow than in anger. As I'll try to show, he is burdened with two really big conundrums. One, of course, is the chaos in this region, and the other is what we just might call the paralysis at home in the policy-making arena inside the Washington Capitol Beltway. So that's it. And while we had hoped that he would do what is called in Washington a reset of U.S. positions in the Middle East, it really hasn't turned out that way. But we certainly hope so. And here is President Obama at Cairo University in 2009 delivering a famous and, if I may say so, hopeful speech about America's relationships with the Muslim world. I think at the time, certainly his audience in Cairo was largely impressed, and the audience at home, I think, was hopeful that in this post-9/11 world, in the world after the attacks of September 11th, 2001 in New York and Washington and elsewhere, that which had severely strained America's connections and relations and perceptions of the Muslim world, that things would change. And it certainly seems that this was Mr. Obama's intent. But this hope has, I think, not been fulfilled. And instead, we've seen a series of inconsistencies and failures. And we'll just make a list. We're seeing that in the primary struggle, which has become almost an obsession now in Washington, the struggle against Daesh, against ISIL, ISIS, whatever you choose to call it, the United States is, as we all know, now increasingly involved militarily against Mr. Obama's preferences, which were to try to decrease the American military presence and role in the Middle East. And while this has been happening, Daesh seems to be growing. And even though the military, the airstrikes have been going on now for some weeks in Iraq and lately in Syria, so far, according to American diplomats that I've talked to and many others, the tide has not turned, and the Daesh is continuing to grow, to attract recruits, partly as a result of the new American airstrikes. And not only is that a problem, but organizations sympathetic to and to some degree affiliated with Daesh are also all too alive and well. On Nusra Front, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and so on and so forth. So paradoxically and unfortunately, the massive effort, the war on terror, as Mr. Obama's predecessor called it, to try and extirpate the people that were responsible for 9/11 and many other bad things that have happened, we're not winning it. Doesn't seem to be going away. And if anything, the problem has metastasized, increased, and so on. So there's a problem there. And in the same vein, I think so far one has to take a skeptical view of the bombing in Syria. I know there are people in Lebanon that were quite excited and encouraged when they heard the news that American airplanes were now not just attacking Daesh in Iraq, but also in Syria. But I don't think I need to elaborate why this is a very complicated issue full of paradoxes where one has to try to make very fine distinctions between enemies, attacking some and ignoring others, and with the result that at this level of military involvement, and to the extent that it is essentially a military involvement without a political component, we cannot be too encouraged that Mr. Obama has got a clear, credible strategy with an end point. Tactical moves, yes, many of them have been applauded, but a strategic vision is still, I think, a little bit murky. And there's the question about Iran. And here, again, as in so many Middle Eastern issues, the administration is conflicted. Primary concern, especially if you look at this through the lens of American domestic politics, is the Iranian nuclear file. And so the principal focus of attention has been trying to reduce or eliminate, eradicate, contain Iran's military nuclear ambitions, which of course the Iranian government denies it has, and the P5+1 talks with Iran go on and on, with the administration on the one hand hoping that there might actually be an acceptable compromise, but with many other people in Washington thinking that this is a really bad idea and that the Americans are simply being fooled by the Iranians. And that's only half the problem, because the other difficulty is that from Washington's perspective, Iran's projection of its power and influence throughout the region through what some observers call the Shiite crescent is, of course, of great worry. It brings back memories of bipolarity and Cold Wars when American policymakers look at this new axis. They don't call it an axis of evil anymore. That was something that his predecessor called it, but the idea of an Iran being able to influence affairs through Iraq, which it now can, thanks to American mistakes in Iraq, has enormous influence in, through Syria, and all the way, of course, here into Lebanon with Hezbollah. That axis, from Washington's perspective, needs to be opposed by another axis. But the other axis, the sort of the Sunni moderate axis, as it is called, is still a bit inchoate, and many American analysts are not entirely comfortable with the Arab allies that fall within this category. So Iran is a conundrum and a problem that has yet to be solved. We've seen, as we turn to the outcomes of the Arab uprisings, a turnaround in Egypt. And lately, we have seen, to the distress of many liberals in the United States, Washington basically accepting the new and highly repressive and rather brutal regime of Field Marshal Sisi in Cairo, for reasons that realists in international affairs, will clearly understand. So there is a question of ideals, that is to say, the ideal of democracy promotion, which has been promoted off and on by many administrations in the United States, coming up against the hard realities of power politics and the realization that Egypt is very important for the security of Israel and for the containment of Hamas and so on and so forth. There is another difficulty. As we look at the whole scene, I think the big winners, if there are any in this complicated situation, are the American defense industries. Among the very active lobbyists in Washington are the major companies that deal in arms and sell a great many of them, and will continue to sell a great many of them to governments in this area and to the American government itself as it continues to engage in what is largely a kind of military approach to the Middle East. The United States has now bombed more than once, in some cases, in how many Middle Eastern countries? Syria, Iraq, Yemen, farther afield, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia. I find it a troubling collection of military activities. I think, therefore, that the problem with Obama's approach is now that he, first of all, perhaps the problem is that it's been too passive, and that's what his critics tend to say. But secondly, when he is moved to action, the action seems to be essentially limited military involvement and essentially focused on counterterrorism, with politics and diplomacy in some ways seeming to be relegated to the sidelines. There hasn't been, as far as I can tell, a lot of really creative thinking about how one might engage in politics and diplomacy to handle some of these matters. And all of these issues and problems, I think, are reflected in microcosm right here in Lebanon, where we have the shadow of Daesh. We have the one end of the Iranian axis, as it were, through Hezbollah. And we have, as we usually do have in Lebanon, a weak state a weak military, a paralyzed domestic political scene in which Lebanon cannot even elect a president, a situation that we keep holding our breath that will continue not to explode. But I think there are people here that know much better than I do and feel probably more intensely than I do the tension that Lebanese must feel over an extremely dangerous situation. So that's what I wanted to tell you. Now, I want to, well, before I go to that, I want to say just a word on a more academic side about how we study foreign policy. I think here, without hopefully oversimplifying too much, we can imagine three broad sort of intellectual paradigms or stances on dealing with how nations conduct their foreign policy, their defense policy, how and why they make wars, and so on and so on. One is the famous, and perhaps the dominant one, certainly in policymaking circles, is the realist approach, the classical realist paradigm, which holds that states are the primary, maybe the sole unit of analysis in an environment of anarchy and uncertainty. States act in a rational manner to defend their basic security. And from that, they will engage in coalition building, trying to create a favorable balance of power in a regional or an international global system in which there is no higher authority. There is no deus ex machina that will sort of order things because in the realist conception, it is a world of anarchy. The strong do what they must, the strong do what they will, the weak will do what they must, as Thucydides famously said. And there is an approach to the Middle East that reflects that kind of realist stance. The second approach is through the realm of political economy, and perhaps in particular through the study of imperialism and Marxism, a stance that suggests that states do what they do, and powerful states in particular do what they do for economic gain, for accumulation of capital, for the monopoly of resources, and so forth and so on. And from that perspective, of course, in the Middle East, it perhaps boils down to the question of oil. This is what it's all about, and American policy can basically be understood in a larger sense as the quest for secure oil and gas resources. Hence the strong alliances and the remarkably dense military presence of the United States in the Gulf. And that kind of tells you where you're at. The third approach is more eclectic, it's more sociological in nature, and it has to do with the balance of forces in the domestic arena. If the classical realist theory basically assumes that the state is a black box, a monolith, and it doesn't really matter what goes on inside it, this sociological approach says, no, that's completely wrong, that you can't understand why nations do what they do without studying their decision-making processes, without studying the socioeconomic landscape in these countries, and so forth and so on. And therefore, that's what you should be looking at. So from that perspective, the proper course, say at AUB on international relations, would basically be a course in comparative foreign policies. You would simply study the foreign policy of America, Russia, and so on, and somehow it would all come together. To the realists, that is completely wrong, because they argue that it is the actual impact of the system, the effect of the system itself, and the balance of forces within the system that really shapes what states do. But in our case, in the Middle East case, it is hard not to want to pay a lot of attention to this domestically oriented sociological approach, because Middle East politics is so deeply embedded in the American domestic political scene. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So from this perspective, there are many ways you can go. You can look at the collection of rather complicated governmental and quasi-governmental structures and institutions that play a role in foreign policy making. You can look at the media. You can look at, and you should in this case, look at the lobbies that play their role. And you can even look inside the bureaucracy, as some scholars have done, and argued that the policy is kind of the outcome of bureaucratic bargaining within a large government. That would lead you to think, well, what happens is really the result of whether the Pentagon has more influence than the State Department at one particular time or another. So with that, just to sort of, for us to put in the back of our minds, because I'm going to go to sort of oscillate between all three of these perspectives, let us turn to the several problems. I want to start with the problem of history. And I want to go back to the 19th century, because I think it is not irrelevant to recall that from the very founding of the American Republic, there has been a kind of a dialectic, a tension between what we call the idealist position versus the realist position. And it's all in a way, in a sense, embedded in one of our first presidents, Thomas Jefferson, who famously came to office committed to building up the new United States by focusing on its domestic growth and eschewing any kind of foreign involvement. And indeed, his predecessor, George Washington, made similar points that we do not want to get involved unnecessarily in the sordid affairs of the rest of the world. But as this illustration shows you, it was Jefferson himself that launched America's first foreign military intervention in the Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean, early in the 19th century, in a series of wars, or skirmishes at least, mostly naval skirmishes, between the very fledgling United States Navy and the corsairs, the pirates that were operating out of Tripolitania and what later became Algeria and Tunisia, and so forth. So we have a history that goes back quite a long way, from isolationism versus interventionism, from idealism versus realism, and this carries on in American history all the way up to the present time. If we fast forward to Vietnam, we see here a project that combines, in a sense, a realist sense of a security problem involving the expansion of Soviet communism in the world, and an idealist conception that we must protect people in the underdeveloped countries from the evils of communist ideology as we saw it. And we had several presidents. They're their picture here before you, President Kennedy, President Johnson, President Nixon, who involved us all the way from the beginning to the rather humiliating end of the Vietnam War. So, and it goes on and on. We fast forward to the present, and we see that, of course, the Soviet Union is gone, the Cold War is over, but suddenly there are new problems, and the question is what to do about it. And here, again, we see interventionists as opposed to isolationists. We see realists as opposed to idealists who are saying we have to, as President George W. Bush put it, we have to have a war on terror. It's hard to remember at this juncture that initially after the attacks of 9/11, there was a serious debate in the United States as to whether there ought to be a war against terror or whether in fact this was a crime that ought to be handled through traditional police methods. But in American policy, we tend to go from one extreme to another, and in this case, it was decided that war was the appropriate modality. The object of the war, terror or terrorism, was never clearly defined, and that has led, I think, to some of our subsequent problems. But at the same time, in particular in the administration of Mr. Obama's predecessor, George W. Bush, there was an idealistic argument to be made for intervening in the world to secure our homeland, but also to promote the ideals that the country likes to think it has stood for from the very beginning. Just as there were poets who wrote very romantic poems about the city on the hill and the need to spread not just enlightenment, but also actually Protestantism back in the early 19th century. AUB is one of the fruits, I think, of that impulse. Here, there was, in the minds of the neoconservatives and the Bush administration, a convergence of interests, convergence of interests and ideals. It was to protect the national interest that we had to have a war on terror, but it was also in the furtherance of American ideals of promoting enlightenment and democracy in the world that we should opt to use our power as what a subsequent an earlier Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, famously called the indispensable nation. That was the United States, to use the powers, God's gifts to the United States to spread enlightenment, good government, human rights, and so forth. I can remember that it was a bit irritating to liberals during the neocon phase in the Bush administration that those people were, in a sense, preempting values that the liberals had sort of thought were theirs: democracy, human rights, so forth and so on. But my only point here is that we see once again simultaneously the pursuit of ideals, which often involve what we would like to think of as benign intervention, and interests, which also may involve intervention, although not necessarily so benign. And so in trying to understand the American approach to these things, I think it's helpful to recall the tension between these two poles of realism and idealism, which morph into issues of interventionism and isolationism. If George W. Bush was an interventionist, and it turns out largely to be a failed interventionist, Mr. Obama seems in his heart of hearts to tend toward preferring to be an isolationist, but he, as we've seen lately, finds it very difficult actually to do that. So much for the history problem. Now I'd like to turn to the framing problem. And this has to do a lot with stereotyping. What I want to try to convey here is the significance of those who tell the American public and who tell the foreign policy establishment of the United States what the world is really like. And it's a complicated business. But suffice it to say that the issue of framing has often been, I think, at odds with the realities of the regions being framed. And I'm thinking, of course, in particular of the Middle East. So we have on the level of popular opinion of how do Americans look at the Arab world, how do they look at Islam and so forth, we have the persistence of a negative stereotyping, much of which is promoted through the mass entertainment media conglomerates, Hollywood being the case in point. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Jack Shaheen's colorful and instructive work on the stereotyping of Arabs that has gone on in the United States. But beyond the sort of popular imagery, which does play a part, there's also, I think, at another level, a tendency on the part of the opinion makers, the foreign policy opinion makers, to simplify, dichotomize, and sometimes just get carried away with their own opinions and views that may be not really perhaps accurate reflections of reality. And let me suggest a couple of things. This gentleman here is Thomas Friedman. He's a very, very influential columnist for the New York Times. He and a number of other similarly influential columnists held a secret meeting with President Obama just before Obama delivered his speech on escalating military involvement in Iraq and in Syria. And it was interesting that these names, and I think they're well known to many of you, Thomas Friedman, David Brooks of the New York Times, David Ignatius of the Washington Post, Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, Dexter Filkins and George Packer of the New Yorker, Jeffrey Goldberg and Peter Beinart from the Atlantic, Julia Jaffe from the New Republic, Steve Cole from the Columbia School of Journalism, and Michael Tomasky from the Daily Beast. Obama called them together, presumably to seek their advice or get their ratification, at least, of what he wanted to do. It's interesting that many of these columnists are hawkish and conservative. They are, many of them were pro-intervention, pro-war, pro-military involvement of some kind. And I mention this only because I think it's instructive to ask how the top decision makers and how the president himself actually gets his information. From whom does he get it? And what agendas might some of these people be pursuing? You might or might not agree or disagree with the overall conservative and somewhat hawkish cast of most of these people that the president called for advice, but it does seem pretty clear that there was nobody in that group, and there are no really loud voices saying, no, you should not intervene, this is a very bad idea, you will be sorry, and so on. That's not the kind of message that presumably he was hearing from these people. And of course, these people are not the really hardcore, extreme voices on the American media landscape. I'm not talking about the talking heads for Fox News, for example, and commentators that are much more strident, much more biased, even to the point of really expressing racist kinds of views about the Middle East. These are mainstream people, but the question is their framing of Middle East issues sufficiently inclusive or not? I'm inclined to think that it is not. I could cite, but maybe you've actually seen recent articles, columns. Again, just take the ones in the New York Times, who are absolutely deeply obsessed, I would say, with the evil nature of Daesh. And they do actually use the word evil. This is, if you want to, this is evil. This is just plain evil, and there's nothing else but that. So you must do something about it. So you have columnists like David Brooks saying this is, this is such a horrible evil because, and he describes it in rather uncomfortable detail. He sort of concentrates on how they kill people. People who cut people's throats are, truly evil. People that kill tens of thousands, with barrel bombs or missiles, they're not necessarily purely evil. They might be a little bit evil, but they're not really purely evil. And they go on. Roger Cohen, who is usually a very sensible columnist in my view, but absolutely has said that this is, he says we don't even have to ask why they do these things. We just have to get rid of them. And that, I think, underlies much of the argument for emphasizing a military solution to the complicated problems that we face. So Tom Friedman may or may not be right. I think he's not right when he says, speaking of Arab civilization, he says this is a civilization in distress, and unless it fades, the pathologies that have given birth to an ISIS monster in its belly, any victory achieved from air or ground will be temporary. And there are similar quotes that one could pull out from others. Roger Cohen says, but it is a rotten Arab order that is at risk and must find a response to ISIS. This is the Arab 0 hour, and so on. I've just pulled these out of recent issues of the paper that some of you have probably already seen as well. All I'm suggesting here really is that in trying to understand or even trying to suggest improvements in the conduct of American policy, we need to look carefully at how the Middle East is presented, how it is framed for the eyes and brains, if there are any, of decision makers. So that's the framing problem. Now let me turn to the institutional problem. Here I want to get into the question of the presidency. If we can get into Obama's mindset, there are things to be said. We need to look at the landscape of structures and institutions and organizations that all in some way feed in to this sausage-making machine, the policy-making process on the Middle East. Start with Obama. President Obama gave a very thoughtful and revealing, lengthy interview to the editor of the New Yorker magazine some months ago. And in this interview, we have Obama kind of reflecting off the top of his head about the nature of the world and America's role in it. And I think his views can be summed up as minimalist. He's saying that it is wrong to think that the United States can reshape the countries of the world, or in particular the countries of troubled regions, in a manner that we would like to see. That we just don't have that ability. We don't, in a world that has become much more complicated, much more globalized, much more energized by social media, and in a world in which established state structures and regimes in many parts, especially in the Middle East, are crumbling or in danger or in transition. The United States may be by far still the biggest superpower, the only superpower in the world, but it can't do that. And Obama is saying, I understand that. All we can do is really sort of nudge things from the side. Or perhaps in a phrase that he used with respect to the American low-key involvement in the Libya campaign, leading from behind. Now that, of course, doesn't sit well at all with conservatives, with hawks, with patriots, people that do sincerely believe that the United States is not only number one, but has a responsibility and the ability to shape things in the world to our preferences. This sounds weak-kneed and soft and to some dangerous, because if the Americans are being weak, that invites the bad guys to fill in these spaces with very nasty forms of behavior. So, Obama is cautious. He is scholarly, a bit pedantic perhaps, and modest in what he thinks the United States can do in the world at this time. And remember, he got elected on a campaign of getting us out of Iraq and getting us out of Afghanistan. And he thought, I think many people agreed, I certainly agreed, that those resources could be much better used to rebuild America's crumbling physical infrastructure and so on and so on. But he is being attacked viciously for being soft. But anyway, that's the way he is. But that's not the whole story. Obama is the decision maker. The buck stops there. He's the decider, as his predecessor said. But he is also strongly influenced by powerful lobbies. And the most powerful lobby dealing with the Middle East is called AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. But AIPAC is only one of a network of pro-Israel organizations, not all of which are Jewish, by the way, that reach out into every state and city in the United States and which exert powerful financial and political influence over candidates for public office, not just the presidency, but also for members of the Congress, for state offices, governorships, and so on and so on. It is almost, well, I think it is essentially obligatory for all presidents and all serious candidates for the presidency to put in an appearance at AIPAC's annual meeting in Washington, which attracts thousands and thousands of people, to take the platform to convince their audience that they are more supportive of Israel than their opponents are. And it is common knowledge that at this point, Mr. Obama detests Mr. Netanyahu, can't stand him. But Obama has to deal with realities, and even if he is a second-term president and cannot run again himself, he is still part of a Democratic Party. He still wants to promote the political interests of his party in the future. So there he is, and we have to simply face this reality. If AIPAC, on the one hand, is a very powerful force which has essentially blocked the possibility of an even-handed American policy toward Palestine over the years. The other very substantial lobby, which I've already mentioned, is the business lobby. And they have their own fish to fry. They're not political in that sense, but they are business-oriented, and they want to encourage the United States to increase its arsenal and to sell weapons and drones and technologies where they can. So there are the lobbies. Then we move to the Congress. In the United States, there is a separation of powers, but unlike the parliaments in this part of the world and many other parts, the American Congress is actually very powerful. Under the Constitution and under the laws that have been established and the rules, it has the last word on budget matters and on funding, and it can exert and does exert a very powerful constraint on the president. Even though the president is the commander-in-chief, the executive branch is supposed to be the branch that conducts foreign affairs, the Congress is absolutely important. And here, I have provided you with photographs of some of the individuals that have really weighed in on the Middle East. Most prominent among them, Senator John McCain, there on your left, upper left. Senator Ted Cruz, these are both Republicans. Senator Ted Cruz from Florida, who recently shocked a gathering of Middle East Christian leaders by suggesting that the Christians in the Middle East had no better friend than Israel, which caused some of these prominent religious leaders to walk out. They were surprised. They shouldn't have been, but they were surprised by what they heard because Mr. Cruz is running for president. You have John Boehner, the Speaker of the House. You have on the Democratic side the Senate, Senator Harry Reid. All of these people play into the mix. Then we have the people in the various key parts of the executive branch in Washington. We have the military, we have the generals, and here you see General Petraeus, who was very famous until he fell afoul of a personal scandal for his conduct of the American military operations in Iraq. You have the present head of the Joint Chiefs, General Martin Dempsey, who has very interesting things to say about what can be done. And then we have the Secretary of State, John Kerry, who has perhaps Kerry's represents in a way the more liberal voice in the executive branch, who was famous, as you will all remember, for having tried very hard to restart Palestinian-Israeli peace talks, but he was sabotaged, as regularly happens in this story, by Israeli refusal to buy into his proposals. But what I'm suggesting here is that all of these folks have input of one sort or another. And then we have the think tanks. This is Jessica Matthews, the head of the Carnegie Endowment, one of the major think tanks in Washington. And the think tanks in Washington play a rather prominent role. There are dozens and dozens of them, but on the Middle East there must be at least 5 or 10 that are really quite important. And in the Washington circles, if you're sitting there, as I have for many years, opening my email, you could spend most of every working day going to one event or another that's put on by one of these think tanks, because that's what they do. They think, or at least think they think. And what they do on the Middle East is actually quite important. I think it's fair to say that the think tank community in the Middle East is divided rather like the parties in the Arab-Israeli conflict. There are the pro-Israel think tanks that are very large and well-funded, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, for example, the Conservative Heritage Foundation, the Hudson Institute, no relation to me, American Enterprise Institute, and so forth, leaning to the more pro-Israel, more conservatives, and often more hawkish way of looking at the Middle East. And then there are a few lately that have emerged as quite important that are rather more to the left. And here, I think the Carnegie Endowment would be a good example. The New America Foundation would be another one. I have left out the Brookings Institution because I think the Brookings Institution is somewhat schizophrenic on the Middle East, with part of it being sort of colored by a pro-Israel orientation, and other parts not so much. But the point being that there they are, and these are the people that will feed into the public debate about the Middle East. Now, what does that matter? Well, I think there's work to be done on this subject, and I suppose that the Issam Fares Institute would be a good place to do it, to study, to critically study what the Washington think tanks really think about the Middle East, and whether their thoughts are creative, original, or not. And I'm tending to think that there is not a lot of original thinking going on when it comes to the Middle East. And there tends to be, particularly in times of violence, a tendency to exaggerate, simplify, and dichotomize issues, so that they tend, I think, to present things in more of a black and white manner than perhaps academic scholars of the Middle East would. So, there we are. And if there's one other point to make about the domestic institutional environment, I guess it has to do with who's going to be the next president of the United States. And if you're looking for salvation and enlightenment on Middle East issues, you may be disappointed, because the leading candidate for 2016 so far on the Democratic side is Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's views on the Israeli assault on Gaza are sober reading, and one would have to wonder whether she will be as discerning or as cautious as President Obama. In a recent interview, she carefully tried to distance herself from President Obama, who is rather unpopular at the moment in the polls, by saying that she would take a more interventionist, a more active part in dealing with ISIS and so forth than the president. Although she then went and met the president and said, no, I didn't mean to think, there's no distance between us at all. But everybody knew that she was obviously trying to put some distance between them. And then finally, this is the last problem, or series of problems, and that's what's going on in the region itself. Here, what can we say? This is a picture of Gaza, the destruction in Gaza. The Palestine-Israel conflict in the American policy environment is a permanent fixture, and despite years of effort, dozens of diplomatic initiatives and so forth, everything has pretty much failed. Even the Camp David talks under Jimmy Carter, even the peace process, so-called, under Bill Clinton, clearly didn't break the knot. And there is no serious sign, I think, on the Washington political landscape that this administration or a new administration is prepared to exert the kind of leadership and essentially pressure on Israeli settlement and colonization that I think, at least in my opinion, would be necessary for a minimally just, peaceful solution. We could go on, but it's too depressing really to talk too much more about it. So let's talk about something that is also pretty depressing, in my view, and that is the trajectory of the several Arab uprisings, but in particular the one in Egypt. Egypt being, if not the most important, at least the biggest of the Arab countries, and a place where initially it was widely thought in 2011 that with the departure of Hosni Mubarak, that a new and less authoritarian era would begin. We all know that despite some very promising efforts, it ended up with an elected president and an elected parliament and a constitution. But the government of the Muslim Brother president, even though it didn't have much time to make good, was almost as high-handed as the previous government and was overthrown in a military coup last year, bringing to power another military man and dashing the hopes, I think, of many of the people that made the uprising in Tahrir Square in hopes of having a democratic Egypt. This was really a counter-revolution, turning things back. And if General Sisi thinks he can model himself on one of Egypt's true heroes, Gamal Abdel Nasser, I think he's got a lot of work ahead of him. But what does this mean for the United States? Well, it means basically that interests have to be dealt with in conjunction with ideals. A lot of work on the part of American-funded NGOs went into trying to promote democracy in Egypt, and there is a strong voice, a liberal voice in Washington, very hostile to the coup, the popularly supported coup that the military engineered to get rid of the democratically elected government and install a new leader who has now been elected president himself. But for the Americans, it's a question of do you follow your interests? And as I indicated earlier, it's pretty clear that Egypt has always played an important role in the strategic architecture, the security architecture of the United States and the Middle East. And even though there's a lot of unhappiness with the highly repressive regime that has now been put in place, it appears that the United States says, well, we've got to deal with these people for reasons that I have already indicated. But it makes people wonder whether the Americans aren't a bit hypocritical when they say, on the one hand, we promote democracy and human rights, and on the other, we don't really seem to do that. It is, I think, widely agreed, actually, in Washington, that the American invasion of Iraq, subsequent occupation, and the effort to construct a new Iraqi government was a failure and perhaps a catastrophe, because it does look as if out of the turmoil of Iraq after the fall of Saddam emerged Daesh. And so counter to any sort of realist assessment of American interests in this part of the world, what the United States actually did seems to have contravened those basic interests. Instead of eradicating terrorism, it spawned it. Instead of containing Iran, it opened the door. And therefore, one has to wonder, how do these things happen? With all of the intelligence, all of the think tanks, all of the media, all of the information that Washington is marinated in, how is it that really bad decisions get made? But that's the way things are. And if they weren't so bad in Iraq, they're perhaps even worse in Syria. And here we have the paradox of the United States today having insisted at the outset that Bashar must go, and that this is a brutal regime that has no compunctions about indiscriminate killing of tens, hundreds of thousands of civilians, when the United States is deploying its military capabilities, it's not deploying them against that bad regime, it is deploying them against something that the Americans, the American opinion makers have framed as something even worse, which is Daesh and its various collaborators and offshoots. And I can quote, but there's no need to, many a military leader, many a think tank pundit who says, that this is security problem number one, and that's why we have to do it. But we have to do it at a point in which we have to be very careful of who to hit and who not to hit. But if part of the Obama strategy is to build, first of all, inclusive and capable governments in Iraq, good luck, that's not going to happen in the next month or two. And the same thing in Syria, and that's not going to happen in a month or two. Where are we going? And that's why critics, even friendly critics of the president, say, you don't have an end game in mind. You don't seem to have a credible pathway to an outcome that is better than what we have. So here we have Syria run by a very brutal regime, opposed by groups, some of which are perhaps even more brutal. And it comes now, perhaps finally, as we get to the end of this sad story, to Iran. And as I've indicated already, the American attitude on Iran is quite ambivalent, but there's a very interesting dialogue or discussion going on in the press and certainly in policy circles now as to whether the United States and Iran, since they seem to share several key interests, ought not to be reconsidering the idea of what was a number of years ago promoted by the Iranians as a grand bargain, where there would be a settlement of a nuclear issue, there would be understandings on reaching a political solution in Syria, an improvement in Iraq, because these are two countries in which Iran has a great deal of influence. But this has greatly angered and concerned the traditional Arab oil-rich monarchies of the Gulf, who feel that Iran is the problem, and that from their point of view, they see Iranian meddling in Yemen with the growing prominence of the Houthis. They see Iranian meddling in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. They see Iranian meddling in Bahrain, and they fear that the world of Sunni Islam is being surrounded by the Shiite world. But what do you do? No easy answers there. And then one final word about pivoting. I've been sitting in Singapore for the last 4 years, and Singapore is a place that is very close to China, depends a great deal on China. China is a big economic, financial force in Singapore. At the same time, Singapore has an American military facility, is very concerned that the United States stand up to what they worry is an expansionist China, and so forth and so on. Well, Singapore is too small, perhaps, to be really all that much worried, but other places in Asia, allies of the United States, especially Japan, Philippines, even Vietnam, which has become a kind of an ally, are very concerned about China's expansionist efforts in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and so on. And so when American strategists recognize that China is rising, the idea of shifting the weight of the American military presence from Europe and the Middle East toward Asia took root. Well, it hasn't borne a lot of fruit so far, and I can tell you that there is a great deal of cynicism among Asian strategists and analysts that the Americans are really serious or perhaps capable of pivoting in a manner that the Chinese will take account of. This is a photograph of a Chinese naval vessel in the South China Sea. So the debate has been in Southeast Asia, why aren't you pivoting more? Whereas I think in the Middle East, the debate is, don't pivot too much because there's too much going on here. And while I think Obama and the Pentagon planners, the people that look down the road, do see emerging strategic concerns in Southeast Asia and Asia, they can't seem to get out of the Middle East. The Americans are stuck. I am not a believer in the idea of American decline, by the way. Even though the Pentagon budget is shrinking a little bit and so forth and so on, I do not buy into the view that is very widely expressed in Asia, at least, maybe it is here, that the United States is a big power in decline and it will soon shrink, you know, to the proportions of former imperial masters of the world that are now, you know, kind of peripheral. I don't really buy into that, but I do sympathize with Obama's rather nuanced conception of the limits of American power. At any rate, this administration is kind of stuck because the Chinese are moving ahead out there. They're moving eastward and southward, but they're also moving westward toward the Middle East, not through military means certainly, but through other commercial, financial, cultural ways. And the United States, even if it's not declining, it's surely not expanding. And as for the Middle East, the question, I think, comes down finally to the question of the efficacy of military force. The United States is by far the most powerful military force in the world and will remain so for a very long time. Not about to be overtaken by the Chinese or anybody else. But what can you do with military power? And one of the lessons, it seems, from the Middle East is that when you exert it, when you use it, the results are often disappointing. Which brings to mind, I forget who is responsible for this aphorism, somebody will remind me, about the British Navy, who said that the power of Britain and the power of the British Navy was most evident when it did not have to be used. But when you use it, often the results are disappointing, and there are after effects and unintended consequences that can be really bad. And so, in conclusion, very quickly, I think, as I've indicated, the global balance of power is changing. The Middle East states, many of them are decaying, and the Middle East state system has become much more unstable than it once was, with the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the effort to fill vacuums, power vacuums in the crumbling states of Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Libya, so on. That's interesting and problematic. I think that social media are galvanizing societies, are energizing populations, are in their way eroding conventional and classical sort of norms of legitimacy, which tends to promote, transformation, change, and instability. We used to talk, and some of our officials, like I think Madeleine Albright, talked about Pax Americana. And certainly in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a good deal of discussion that in this new era, the United States would be supreme, the only unchallenged superpower, and that with that kind of unchallenged leverage, it could promote tranquility, American style, in all the trouble spots of the world. I don't think anybody is thinking that anymore. And Obama's modest analysis may be right, that it may be that even a military giant cannot really do all that much with military means alone. Other instrumentalities need to be used. And it's not easy, and we may not be as good at doing the political as we are at doing the military. And yet, despite all that, despite his own instincts and preferences, he's being pulled into new military action, as we have seen. And furthermore, as I've indicated, he is constrained by all of the institutional pressures and blockages and counterweights that are built into the American political process. So he can't just be, like Bismarck and say, well, I'll do this or I'll do that, and no one's going to challenge me. And especially when it comes to the key problem, which I think has done most to poison America's soft power and image in the Middle East, which is the Palestine problem. As I've suggested, we cannot be very hopeful of any serious change in American policy down the road. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't try to change it. I don't agree with Palestinian activists who say we should just forget about the American political process and try something else. I think you have to keep plugging away at it, but I cannot say that I'm optimistic. And so, on balance, then I think, given the state of affairs in the United States and given the state of affairs in this region, we must expect continuing instability and turmoil. Let us hope that ultimately it turns out to move affairs in a positive direction. At the moment it doesn't seem to be doing that, but one, I suppose, must always ultimately be optimistic. So thank you very much, and I'll take any comments or questions you might have. Sophia, I think they're going to bring you a microphone. Or whoever is going to get the question, I'm not sure.
Thanks a lot for the lecture. Here. Okay, so I have two questions actually. First of all, the so-called war on terror. I mean, it's been going on since like the war on Iraq, and apparently military action is just failing over and over again. So I think with groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, it would be much more, how do you call it, effective if we actually fight the ideas of these people. I mean, they obviously do not represent Islam, and they do not represent true Muslims. So this is actually the main problem. It's not about military and power, because even if you defeat them now, they will come and emerge again, because they've been there since like 2003, and they keep on emerging. So I think the American administration should at least take that into consideration. Second thing is that I wanted to ask about whether do you think, in your opinion, that the airstrikes that are taking place in Syria, do you think they will be on Assad's side? I mean, do you think they will help him? Or do you think that it's just a way of maybe that after we're going to be done with ISIS, we'll just take care of Assad? So how do you perceive this? Thank you.
Should I take 2 or 3 comments and deal with them, or one-on-one, whatever? Take a few, okay. Dr. Saadi.
Thank you for your lecture. Several questions, actually.
The microphone.
First, I was struck in 2009 when Obama went Cairo to give his lecture on the US and the Muslim world. Is there a Muslim world? I mean, I'm really contesting premises. Is there a Christian world? Is the West Christian? Or is it a combination of religion? Because, I find many intellectuals talking about this West and Islam. Islam is not a geographic entity. So why raise this issue? Another thing is, you mentioned the fact that Thomas Friedman and many others met with Obama to decide on the war. The war raised in the polls the popularity of Obama. He was in a bad shape, and then you have now the congressional elections very soon. Was that a ploy? Because he kept saying this is for 10 years, which means it will not be resolved during his time. It will be resolved later on. Was that to allow the Democratic Party to gain more votes? Because now he is very popular. Does the US or the population in the United States love wars? Or are they frightened, or have they been sent into the fear mode like during the Bush terror or terrorism? That because Obama has said now 2 or 3 times, I heard him saying, the US, because of the Khorasan group, it may hit the United States. And for that, he's getting more and more votes to do the fighting and continue. So is this an internal issue or an external issue? Another thing about the think tanks. In the Middle East, I don't know what the think tanks also are motivated by the lobbies and the people who are paying them, because think tanks get money, and I think the funding helps a lot. Funding helps a lot with deciding who is being recruited, what you are going to do. I know because I have lived in the US, it's very hard to do research contrary to what the people who are funding or the policies of the think tank is. So how can you counter this? There are other questions, but I'm not.
Can we focus on Lebanon just for 1 minute? One thing that I think the Lebanese would like to know is a change in the State Department's attitude toward Hezbollah, if possible, because of Hezbollah's attitude toward Daesh.
Okay, perhaps I should try to respond to all these interesting comments and questions. With respect to the war on terror and the suggestion that to deal with it more effectively, because we don't seem to have been dealing with it very effectively, it seems to be spreading, to try to fight their ideas, these very extreme, rather primitive kind of interpretations of Islamic doctrine. Excellent thought, but I think there's a problem when President Obama and other high American officials insist categorically, and they have done this recently and repeatedly, that Daesh is not Islamic. Well, maybe most people would agree with that, but I think many Muslims would say, well, who's this American president to tell anybody what's Islamic and what's not? Is he some kind of an expert on Islam? Does he really know? Does he have the authority, the legitimacy to make these statements, even though everybody probably would agree with them? It seems to me that you're absolutely right. These ideas need to be challenged, but wouldn't they be much more effectively be challenged by other Muslims in the region? And in fact, of course, this is happening. I mean, we've seen statements, declarations, petitions, interviews by the Sheikh al-Azhar and the highest Islamic officials of Saudi Arabia and many other places. Muslims in Southeast Asia, Muslim leaders, they're all getting up and saying, this is a scourge and so on. And Muslims in the UK, Muslims in the United States, they're saying this. So it's not as if they haven't thought of it, but I should imagine that somehow the people in the region itself are the most important ones, and I think the people in the West ought to show a little bit of modesty in saying, well, we support those Muslims who say that this is a bad thing. I think a little bit of distancing there would be helpful. On the question, the airstrikes are they really helping Assad? Well, I think he thinks they are. I think I detect a certain kind of smugness on the part of the declarations of Syrian officials who are saying, well, we told you so, that this was a strike against terrorism, and now you refuse to believe us, and now finally, belatedly, you are taking our side. It puts the United States in an awkward position. There's no doubt, and the American officials don't make any secret of it. But I think a key question from a military point of view is, if these airstrikes succeed in eliminating Daesh from certain places in Syria, what will replace them? And then you get in, and then it gets very murky, and I don't know what the answer is, and I haven't heard military people, give any good answers either. I don't think people really know. If Daesh leaves, Raqqa, who moves in there? The Free Syrian Army, the Kurds, al-Nusra, or Assad? Not entirely clear. I mean, I've heard people say, but there's disagreement on this, that the Syrian, the reach of the Syrian army and security, even as it has been substantially augmented by Hezbollah, is limited. And so that, maybe they can't do it, in which case it would be a case of modified rapture on the part of the regime that, at least they got rid of our worst enemy. We can't fill the gap, but it's better than nothing. The other question that comes up is whether one thing leads to another, and that is whether if in the process of or having done serious damage to Daesh, the Americans and the French and Saudis and everybody else who's flying airplanes out there would say, well, let's go after Syrian army here or there in a kind of stealthy way. And that would be very bad news, of course. And that would presuppose a decision on the part of the people that are flying those planes that this is a regime that somehow needs to go. And I don't know that there's whether there's any agreement on that, because there's a lot of people that say you're not ever going to get rid of this regime by military means alone. That the most reasonable option is some kind of negotiation, which might leave Bashar al-Assad in power, maybe not, but it would be one that kind of brings what remains of the Syrian state and authorities and government and administration into some sort of agreement with those that have been, calling for the utter destruction of the regime. My sense is that American diplomats are, they don't say it in so many words, but a little bit frustrated that they can't deal more directly with the Syrians, and indeed to get to the Lebanon question, to deal with Hezbollah, which they're not allowed to do, of course, here in Lebanon. So, as for Sophia Saadi's several observations, Well, I think maybe this is a question of framing, but it certainly was, this is a question of, is there a Muslim world? And that's a tough one. I think, you know, my understanding is that, you know, Muslims that I've been working with and dealing with in Southeast Asia feel that there is a Muslim world, that they feel a certain kind of community. It's not geographic, it's not contiguous, but it's spiritual and it's meaningful with Muslims anywhere, Muslims in Morocco, UK, wherever. And I think also the other factor that probably explains why Obama framed the idea of a Muslim world that way stems from the 9/11 attacks, because they were carried out by extremist Muslims. And okay, that raises another complicated question. But in that sense, the idea, there was a great concern, and still is, in the United States, that Muslims the world over will feel that America is against them because of their religion, and that's why Obama said no, we that's not what we had in mind at all. But I would ask Muslims who are much better able to answer that question than I am. I wasn't quite clear on the question about elections, but if it boils down to using the, sounding the alarm about terrorism as a way to gain popularity in the upcoming congressional elections, in general, for politicians, whether they're in the United States or other places, I like to say that terrorism is the gift that keeps on giving, because there's nothing better than a serious, scary threat to cause people to rally around the authorities, whoever they may be. Is Obama playing this for the congressional elections in November? I doubt, and I doubt it mainly because I believe these elections, which are not for the presidency, these are state and congressional elections. In those elections, domestic issues usually play a more important role than foreign issues. Terrorism is a political weapon. It's a resource if you can monopolize it to your advantage, and it's a problem if your adversaries can hit you for not being sufficiently vigilant and effective against the terrorists. But I wouldn't think that there is an immediate domestic consideration that plays into the way the Obama administration is dealing with these matters. And even this rather odd and very sudden and not entirely believable evocation of a group called Khorasan, the last second, I must say many people thought that was very strange, but be that as it may. On the question of think tanks, yeah, well, of course, we know certainly that the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is the largest of the Middle East think tanks, its leadership came out of AIPAC, and its funding, I'm not familiar with the precise details, but I think its funding comes from pro-Israel foundations and individuals, and it's funded very generously. It's able to blanket every congressional office, all congressional staffers, media, et cetera, with position papers. And in fairness to them, it's not that they're sort of slavishly ideological. There are some very smart people that work there, and on issues that are not directly connected with Israel, they have people that work on Turkey, for example. They're not. You take them seriously, but you have a point. And also, with respect to the other side of the fence, the question of, let's say, the oil lobby, the oil and defense lobby, I am not clear on exactly where the money goes, but they a lot of it goes not to think tanks as such, but to public relations firms that will act, to further the interests of Mobil or Exxon or General Dynamics or whatever. The Middle East Institute of Washington, which is a much smaller institute, but goes back till 1948, was and I think still is funded largely by foundations and individuals that are associated with the oil business. Their, how does that affect their positions? I think you will not find a lot of pro-Israeli analysis coming out of it, I would guess. And the big think tanks, I mean, it's a matter of speculation. There's a very prominent, fervent Jewish Zionist businessman named Haim Saban, who gave a lot of money to the Brookings Institution to fund within it a separate Middle East think tank, which is headed by a former AIPAC employee and one-time U.S. ambassador named Martin Indyk. I know people that whose views on Palestine-Israel didn't quite coincide with the ones that were sort of accepted, and they left. But Brookings is a big institution, and has traditionally had a reputation for political neutrality. What the Saban Center does, you have to look at their material, I think, to sort of get a sense of that, and look at the people that are in it. Carnegie, the Carnegie Endowment, I guess, was originally funded by Mr. Carnegie a long time ago, Andrew Carnegie, who made his money in railroads back early 20th century. I don't know whether Carnegie's funding, goes beyond the original endowment or not. We tend to think of Carnegie as being, fairly neutral on Middle East affairs. And then there are some liberal business people and that fund more left-wing think tanks, Institute for Policy Studies, New America Foundation, perhaps. So it's a fair question to keep on asking. Does the donor have a subtle kind of, or even a direct kind of influence on policy making? And then finally, on the question of Lebanon, and will the State Department change toward Hezbollah? I don't know the answer to that, but from what I've heard, they are fully aware of the extraordinary influence and importance of Hezbollah in the Lebanese political system. And they are fully aware of what Hezbollah has been doing in Syria. But at least for the foreseeable future, American diplomats in Lebanon are not allowed to speak to Hezbollah because Hezbollah is on a terrorist list. And even though I think diplomats recognize that Hezbollah has a role to play, and it's a part of the Lebanese mosaic, they're kind of standing off to the side. The days in which a long time ago, when I first came to Lebanon, I remember the late columnist for the Nahar newspaper, Michel Abu Jaudi, once saying, I think in semi-joking manner, during a presidential election crisis here, that the reason we can't elect a president is that we haven't heard from the American embassy what the Americans want. I think American diplomats now are saying, we keep hands off of this. They know exactly who's running and for what, but they're not about to make a choice. And if Michel Aoun wants to have an alliance with Hezbollah, so be it. But the Americans, I think, don't see that they have the leverage to interfere, and that if were they to interfere or be seen to be interfering, it might create a really serious backlash. The short answer is I don't see it right around the corner. That would depend on a larger strategic decision to deal in some ways with the Syrian regime. That's not about to happen, I don't think. Well, we've gone well over time, I think, but if there are any more questions, I'd be happy to deal with them. Sure.
Thank you. I have two questions. I'll try to make them quick. The first one relates to the US bombing campaign in Syria, and that they reportedly struck several Jabhat al-Nusra targets, but publicly never announced that they started bombing Jabhat al-Nusra or other al-Qaeda affiliates. Instead used the name Khorasan group, which left many people puzzled, because they've never heard of such a group before. And my question is, why do you think that the US has been so careful not to admit that they've been striking Jabhat al-Nusra? And my second question relates to US relations with Turkey, and why, in your opinion, is it that they've been so careful not to criticize Turkey in any way when they've been hit with several accusations that they aid, support, collaborate with Islamic State, especially with the flow of fighters coming from the border and the many operations that are taking place right alongside their border on Kurdish villages. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no more questions, I'll just try to briefly respond to those. Are there others? Okay. Well, I think the reluctance to identify Nusra as a target is based on an analysis that Nusra has substantial support among many so-called moderate Muslims in Syria and in Lebanon, and that it would not be smart to announce that you're hitting a group that is not seen as Daesh is perceived as being pure evil, that Nusra, is dealing in I understand, in a very complicated way with, local communities, for example, now in southern Lebanon and elsewhere in Syria, and it's I think the calculation is that maybe there is nothing to be gained by attacking every radical organization in sight. Attack at least one at a time, and maybe you'll end up somehow dealing with the others. Maybe you think that Nusra, even though it is an al-Qaeda offshoot of some sort, actually can be dealt with in some way or other. That would be my speculation on that. The question of Turkey, and there's no secret. It's been much discussed in Washington, kind of Turkey playing a double game. And on the one hand, there's a perception that Erdogan, kind of a neo-Ottomanist, feels that Turkey has a role in promoting Islam generally, and perhaps particularly in places where there are Shiite regimes. But at the same time, there's a sense that there's a belief that the Turks have been unpleasantly surprised by what they have helped create, and now it's turned around to bite them. And that being the case, there is room for collaboration and support. And Erdogan has, I think, talked recently about establishing no-fly fence zone or a corridor even on the Syrian side of the border in order to try to hold back the encroachments of Daesh. And they cannot have been, very pleased at how Daesh has stirred up the Kurdish issue, which hits them in a couple of different ways. And that's not so good. So my guess is that Washington thinks, yeah, the Turks have been playing a double game, but fundamentally we should regard them as being helpful rather than harmful. Okay, one more question. Yes, go ahead.
Throughout the lecture, you were talking about how Obama was trying to change the perception of the war on terror and so on. Obama had several chances to limit the terrorism, quote unquote, that has eventually came to become Daesh. And what I mean by limited, by providing proper infrastructure for people to have other options rather than join the so-called Daesh movement, which does bring up, ISIS, aside from its terrible brutality and the pure evil it has, it does raise pretty good questions against the US, against the West, and so on. So I'm hoping for an explanation. Thank you.
Well, where to go with that? That's, I think, yes, there are broad kind of perceptions that are widely held in Muslim circles everywhere, or many places, that historically the United States has been an imperial power, supported autocrats who did bad things to Muslim political parties or groups or individuals, so on, and that in that sense, Daesh is just fighting the good fight. I'm not quite sure. The first part of your remark, you're suggesting that Obama could have done things that would have perhaps undermined the extreme positions Daesh has taken. What do you have in mind exactly?
What I have in mind is that it could have weakened the need, it would have weakened Daesh's arguments quite significantly. And it could have made it a pretty stupid thing to join Daesh, versus now it seems like an only option to some radicals. It would have decreased the radical tensions, whatever you may call it.
Well, I think the problems lie in Iraq more than in Syria with respect to that question, and I think nobody really denies that the United States made a mess of trying to help bring into power an Iraqi regime after 2003 that would be inclusive and tolerant. But what the Americans did, according to some people, is actually try to impose a Lebanese sectarian kind of model on Iraq. And given the fact that the Shiite militias and Shiite parties were dominant and intolerant, led to this profound alienation and anger of Sunnis, including a good part of the capable workforce of the old Iraqi state and military establishment, and out of which has come Daesh. So you might say, yeah, back somewhere in the effort to fight Zarqawi and the original sort of Iraqi Al-Qaeda by raising the Sahwa and so forth and so on. That was an interesting project, but it kind of ran out of gas, and Sahwa people themselves became disillusioned and became ready recruits. And if you're also suggesting that the Americans or other people, I mean, it's really the job of an Iraqi government, but to improve the living conditions in Anbar and in the in the far western provinces, Sunni areas, that maybe that would have helped, because as I understand it, the people that live there, who are mostly Sunnis and have become supporters, felt that they were denied any kind of government services. They were actually discriminated against, and therefore Daesh to them doesn't look so bad. And to the extent that Daesh is able itself to provide stability and order and some minimal social services and economic relief, I'm not quite sure how well they do that, or if they do that, then ordinary people would say, I'm for Daesh because it gives me a job, or it makes things better than they were. Could something have been done, to prevent that from happening? Possibly, but certainly, the way that the United States mismanaged the occupation made that pretty much impossible. And I don't know, whether in the case of Syria, what could have been done or could be done. You would have thought that initially, at least, the administration came out against Bashar, and you thought, well, that should make Syrian Sunnis happy. But of course, it hasn't turned out that way. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've had a long afternoon. Thanks.